Put that in another. But it was very convenient to start working because I can do that on my computer, put some files on a folder, run my application, and see the files moving. So we're starting working with the file system so we get unlocked and we're starting adding features. After 1 month, they finally came with a protocol. So they told us, hey, you will be using the FTP protocol so you can, share files together. Here are the credentials. So you need to go back to the code, 1 month's worth of code, and everything you have done with the file system, you now need to use the FTP instead. So I did that. It was fine. But then, you can guess what happened. They came back. Like 2 months in the project with a deadline coming, there is no way we could move the deadline. They came back and they say, oops, it won't be FTP. Like, all the thing you have done, that won't work. You need to use HTTP, not even HTTPS, HTTP. So at that point, what you should do, you cannot move the deadline. Specs are changing, that's life. You should renegotiate the scope. What's really important, what needs to be done on the 1st of January so your application works? This is what you need to negotiate. And maybe there are some things we discussed, we agreed on at the beginning, but they are less important. However, in that case, I went back to the code, and like in an hour, I actually was able to migrate everything from using FTP to use HTTP instead. And I had no regression. It was very easy for me to do that. And not only that, but since the very beginning, I didn't even set up an FTP server on my machine. Neither I tried to mock the other systems using HTTP to test my application. We were still using the file system on the development environment and then HTTP for the production. And it's not because I'm a 10x developer or a super coder or whatever. It's because I know some tricks. I don't want to tease you too much, so I'm going to give you right away the conclusion of this talk, like right at the beginning. So if there is one thing you should retain from my talk today, it's this. If you want to write a maintainable software, there is one thing that is universally true that you should do, which is first, identify the domain part, identify the infrastructure part, and then you separate both of them. This is critical. So let me introduce these two terms. My name is Nicolas. I'm working in Montreal, Canada for a nice company named BuzzBud. So at BuzzBud, we do a web application for you to search, compare, and book intercity bus tickets. Meaning that if I want to go from Sofia to Plovdiv and I don't know Bulgaria because I'm a tourist, I can still use my application and find the different kind of buses that they do, find the best, the cheapest one maybe, or the fastest one, and I can still pay in Canadian dollars. Or you can use that and travel to South America, for example, and pay in euros or whatever currency you want. Every day at work, we use some words. So when we speak together, developers, project managers, marketing people, customer support people, we share a vocabulary, like we speak about seats, departures, stops, round trips, etc. And we have the context around these words. You probably don't understand leg the way we do in our context. However, taxes, fees, discount code, that kind of thing, you probably have that too. If you're taking money from people, if you are having a checkout part in your application, you probably have these words too. Regardless, all of these words, they are part of our business, and we talk about these words regardless you're a developer or not. This is our domain. Domain is our business. And one could argue that this domain exists regardless there is a software or not. You could imagine that we have a kiosk in every bus station in these 80 countries with someone behind with a catalog. You come see that person, what are the best available? Oh, you have all of these operators, and here is the best one. You pay money to us, we get some commission, and we make money. No, without software, it will hardly be profitable. That won't be realistic. Software make the business profitable. But it doesn't really matter what kind of technology we use behind for the customers. Here are some of the technologies that we use today. So, for example, we store things into Redis and Postgre databases. We could have used other kind of databases, for example. That doesn't really matter. This is the infrastructure. The infrastructure is what all of the tools that we have made together to make all of this work in real life. But really, the infrastructure part is a detail, meaning that you can change it, and it won't change the business. This is something we miss as developers. We are here to solve the problem. We're here to build the infrastructure to make the business work. And because of that, we focus too much on the solution, and we tend to not speak that much about the problem that we're solving. However, at the heart of our software, we are solving a business problem. And it's important to keep that separation and to put the domain part at the heart of the software, because this part won't change. Or when this part changes, that means you're making your business grow. Let's see that on a concrete example. So it's an example I really like, which is, let's imagine we're building a poetry as a service system. And this is sprint 0. Our project manager, she's asking us to, well, as a user, I should, get a poem from a poetry library. And if I don't get a poem, you should return me the default one, which is listed in the specifications. So let's try to do that the usual way. So, if I was to do that, and by the way, I need to do a disclaimer. These days, since I'm at Buzz, but I mostly do JavaScript, so my PHP is a bit rusty, but the example is simple enough, so you will follow. So at some point, I will create a class which I will call a poetry reader, because yes, it will read some poetry. And this class, it will have a public method, which I will call give me some poetry, because I'm using the words that were in the specification, sounds fine, this thing should give me some poetry. Now, where do I find the poem? So, I ask the question, this is sprint 0, there is some kind of other system that will be writing the poem somewhere on the file system in a text file. So I should really just go and read the content of that text file. And because this is VS Code, so you can see here, it's a bit small, but I do actually have a text file, so this thing will work. This thing will be located in my assets folder. And if I don't have a poem, well, I should go use the default poem that we agreed on, which is a poem from Alistair Cockburn, who coined the hexagonal architecture terms originally. And then I return that poem. Okay. How do I make this work? Well, at some point I need to instantiate the poetry reader class. And then I will just use my CLI here to see the result of that. So I will echo poetry reader, give me some poetry. Okay, let's try that. So I told you this is just a file. Nice. So I get something. It's a French poem, but wait a minute, because in French we have some accented characters, and it seems that we have an encoding problem. My favorite kind of problems. So yes, there is this problem, and we asked the project manager what's happening, and turns out the file we are receiving is not encoding using UTF-8, so we need to convert the encoding. And hopefully in PHP, well, we have a function for that. So MB convert encoding, give it the poem. I want that in UTF-8, and turns out the encoding used is a Western encoding, whatever is a thing. So let's try that again. And here it is, it works. So, classic, short, basic example of what it will look like to develop that kind of feature. Traditionally, we just go and solve the problem and make that work, and that's it. But there are a couple of problems with this. And the main problem I would like to focus on is the fact that we have mixed the domain part with the infrastructure part. Where is the domain? Well, the poetry reader gives me some poetry. This is just domain part. Then the file get content and converting the encoding and all of that, this is infrastructure details. I can probably not ask my project manager to read that code and understand what it means. However, the rest, if there is no poem, the poem then should be the default one and return the poem. This is again like business logic. That my project manager can understand and read the code. The problem of mixing both together is that, first of all, it makes it hard for you to see what is the business logic in the middle of all the infrastructure details. You can imagine some queries to databases and queries to HTTP services. Right in the middle of, there is some business logic here. And because of that, it's hard to test the business logic. Like, I don't have the time to test this, but if I were to test that, I would either need to have an actual setup that like provide me a text file with a poem and one without a poem, so I can test the behavior of my application in both cases. And then I will need to figure out how to listen to the output of the CLI. Or I would mock the low-level details like file get content so I can control what happens here. But that will be terrible, and I will need to rewrite that test every time I need to change how I retrieve the poem. So usually it's hard to test the business because of that. So it's hard to test the code, so people don't test the code, or not all of the business requirements. And when you don't test the business requirements, when you do change the code, for any reason, then it's very likely your code will break, which is a problem. Also, something I want to mention, some people think that this will be a very valid refactoring, to make that code a bit easier to read. I will just extract the infrastructure part in a function, like read encoding file, take file name, and return me the poem. Up. And the path was something like that. Okay, so yes, that's a valid refactoring, extracting a function, but that doesn't change anything to the fact that your domains still depend on the file system here. So better readability, but in terms of testing, you still have the same problem. So this is not what I'm talking about. Let's see how to solve that, and let's discover what is hexagonal architecture. To me, hexagonal architecture, it's the simplest way you could have to do exactly that, to separate the domain part from the infrastructure. It's the simplest way. How simple? That simple. Like, you can hardly do more simple than two potatoes on the screen. This is the simplest architecture I know. And I just didn't draw two potatoes on the screen randomly. I put the domain part at the heart of my architecture. And that's because there is one rule, which is the dependency rule. And that rule says that everything that is outside depends on the inside, but the inside cannot depend on the outside. And this is critical. That means our domain should not know about the infrastructure part. So, where is the hexagon? Here it is. And this is something you should know about the hexagon. There is nothing about the hexagon. Like, hexagonal is a marketing word. Because Alistair Cockburn, so we coined the term hexagonal architecture, originally named it ports and adapters architecture. And that will make sense. But he's also a consultant. I was a consultant. When you are a consultant, you need your ideas to stick in people's mind. So a geometrical shape, it's easier to remember, like it's really a marketing thing. And that's a true story because he told us that. It's an hexagon because, you know, it's very easy to draw. It's very symmetrical compared to like a pentagon. It has not too few sides, not too many, so it's very convenient. And that's it. So this is something you should know about the hexagonal architecture. Hexagonal is marketing, but the core, which is inside, we will see in a moment. So let's focus on the hexagon. How do you make the domain not depend on the infra, but at some point, I need to go and read that file on the file system? If you're doing object-oriented programming, which I guess you are doing if you're using PHP, you should know that we have solved that problem a long time ago using something we call interfaces. So this is an abstraction. This is your intention. And this is your business intention, because yes, I need to get my poem from a poetry library, whatever this poetry library is. So my code, my business code, will depend on that intention. And then, somewhere in the infrastructure layer, I will have an implementation, an adapter that is saying, okay, I will get you your poem in a poetry library, and that will be using the file system. And when I do that, I switch the dependency, I invert the dependency between the infrastructure and the domain. You take the interface, you call that a port, and there you have the ports and adapters architecture. And this is everything that is about this architecture. You put ports inside your domain, and then you build different adapters on the infrastructure side. Super important. Inside your domain, it's not just any kind of interface abstraction. Like, it won't be an HTTP interface. It's a business-oriented interface. Again, your intention. Pay attention to the business language. Try to foster that business language inside your domain, and that will be better for everyone. We have two sides for the adapter. That's just a convenient way to distinguish the two kind of adapters that we can have. The first side is on the left, and it's everything that is exposing your application to the outside world. So that could be, for example, a UI, or a CLI, which was my case here, or it could be a REST API. And that also means that I could plug another way to consume my application without changing anything about the application. And by the way, tests are just another consumer of your application, in a sense. So if you're building for production for a UI, for example, you at least have two kinds of consumer, one being the test. On the right side, you have everything that is needed by the domain to do its stuff. So typical things are querying things from a database or from external web services. Let's go back on our example and try to do that, but applying hexagonal architecture for real. So I will start with the domain, because I can start coding the domain with the business requirements, and I don't care how the thing is implemented exactly. This is like pure logic, so we'll start with the domain part. In the domain, I will, well, create my poetry reader class again. I will keep my give me some poetry function because this was really nice and everyone understands that. And then when I retrieve the poem, this is how the magic happened. I will read the specification again, and this is saying you should get a poem from a poetry library. And if it doesn't say that, go and talk with people, try to understand what is the logic behind, what are the words. So I will just try to reflect that in the code. I got some kind of poetry library here, and this has a get a poem method. I've taken a decision here. Then the rest of the logic is the same. If there is no poem, I should default on Alistair Cockburn poems, and then I return the poem. Okay, I need to get that poetry library, and that I will inject in the constructor. I don't know exactly what is the poetry library implementation, but someone will know and give it to me. And implicitly, we could make it explicit, but there is this interface of the poetry library, and it's kind of a contract. Like, I don't care how is it implemented, but what I do know is this thing needs to give me a get a poem method. So you can build any kind of poetry library as long as it provides this contract, fulfills this contract. Okay. So let's move on the infrastructure part. Everything is done on the business side, and now we need to make things happen with the file system. So on the infrastructure side, I will build a file system adapter here. My file system adapter will need to know about the domain because I will be implementing the interface, and the interface is defined in the domain. So that's how the infra depends on the domain part. So I will do a file system poetry library that implements the poetry library interface. And because it implements the poetry library interface, I need to provide a get a poem public function. So let's do that. And what is the implementation of this? It's the one I had before. I don't, like, the technical solution still needs to happen, but I will put that solution here. And all of the concerns around encoding, for example, will be here. And the business doesn't change because of that. So UTF-8 and ISO 8859. Okay. And I return that poem. Okay, so I have my domain part. I have my adapter. Now I need to make that thing connect together, or it won't work. At some point in your application, you have the entry point of your application. And when you do hexagonal architecture, we use a 3 steps initialization. It's always the same recipe. So I'm giving it to you right now. The first thing you do is you instantiate the right-side adapters. The right-side adapters are the one who provide the domain with, like, capabilities. So in that case, the file system poetry library, this is a left-side adapter. So I will instantiate that. And if it was an HTTP poetry library tomorrow and I need to authenticate, this is where I will provide the configuration for authentication. I won't go in and pass this information to my domain part. It won't care. Then, as long as I got my adapter, I can instantiate my poetry reader, and I will pass the file system poetry library in that case. But you can imagine I pass any kind of other adapter at runtime. And in the end, I need to expose that. So in this example, I'm using a CLI, so I will imagine that I define a CLI adapter in the infrastructure, and I will pass to that adapter the domain. So this adapter doesn't do the business logic. It's the role of the hexagon, the domain part, but it exposes that, like, to the CLI, for example. And then when I'm here, really I have everything. So I will put the app logic, and the app logic, it will use the left side adapters. So in that case, I can, like, echo here is some poetry, give it some space, and then I will use my right side adapters to, do stuff. So ask for poetry, for example, or it could be anything. This is like I'm using the right side adapters in my entry point to kickstart my application and expose that to the outside world. Okay, I need to go back, implement that CLI adapter. So remember, the left side adapters are what we use to expose the application. So I completely arbitrarily decided to name that CLI, and this should have, this will take the domain in the constructor, it will be injected, so it won't know how to actually do the logic. So we'll just store that. And it will have a method that I call ask some poetry. And what does this method do? Well, it will expose to the CLI the results of my hexagon. So in that case, I will just echo the result of it. But really, this is a point where I could, for example, take input from my user and provide that to the hexagon to execute the logic and return that. So I have everything is in place. That should work. I will call that 0203 app. Yes, it works. So, see, I've solved the same problem, but I've used a different kind of architecture. It's a bit more code, but it's not more complex, not that much complex. And I do have time to show you how I will test the domain part, because now it's super easy to test the domain part. And all of the business requirements I can test super easily. So for that I will use PHP unit. And I will test my poetry reader class. So I can test the happy path, the default behavior, which is it should give me some poetry from the library. Usually I recommend you write tests first. In that case, for the flow of the talk, I write them after. But it's good to start with them first because you start from what you wish you have. Also, I structure my test with a given when then structure. Arrange, assert, act, also it's another name for that. And I start with the then part, because the then part, it's the final outputs. So here I'm asking to myself, what do I wish this thing do? Well, I wish this thing return me a result that will equal to the poem I will define. Okay, very generic. But now I know that I need, first of all, the result of my call, which is the when part. When part is, what are you testing exactly? In that case, I get the result from a call to the give me some poetry. So far, I don't really have to think. I just have to apply like the recipe. Okay, now I have to think a bit. Where do I find the poetry reader? Well, I guess I need to instantiate it, so I will imagine that everything is ready for it. So I will instantiate my poetry reader, and I know this thing takes a poetry library. Okay, so now I need to provide it a poetry library. And I told you that the poetry library can really is anything that implements the interface. So in that case, I will provide a mock. And that mock won't change. It won't change for technical reasons. If that mock changes, that means my business is evolving, my intention is changing. So that mock is fine. I am controlling the context, so I can test the logic of my poetry reader. And in that case, I will control the getAPoem method, and in that case, I will return the poem that I now need to define. So I will give it another poem I stored from Masawashiki. All right. So here is my test. Simple to read. I don't care about the file system or anything. Let's try that. So I've got some PHP unit here. Yeah. Let's quickly do the next test. So, how would I test that it returned me the default poem if there is no poem? Well, the beginning is the same. I start with the then part. It should equals the poem from Alistair Cockburn from my result. What is the result? It's the same call. It's usually the case, like your when part is always the same between your tests. So I need the poetry reader again. So really it will be the same thing that takes a poetry library. And the poetry library, again, it's the same thing. It's still a mock of my interface. And the one thing that changes here is that this mock, it will return nothing. So this is how easy it is to test the different use cases. And I can run that again, and it works. Now, when a test works for the first time, always be suspicious. So I'm just gonna make it say something. Oops. Okay, it fails, so it works. And that's it. That's how you do hexagonal architecture. That's everything you need to know, and when you know that, you know all of the basics. But I realize that most of the time, because it's so complexly told, people don't really understand that basics and don't apply that basics. So let me finish on the pros and also the limitation of it. The first thing I want to say is there is nothing new in everything that I said. If you're doing object-oriented programming, programming to an interface, and all of the solid principles, most of them are about interfaces, really they are compatible with that. They're about that, if you follow that. If you're doing functional programming instead, it's not that different. In functional programming, you isolate the side effects of your system with the I/O monad, and you put that at the edge of your system. Because at some point, you need to talk to the file system or to the database so it works. This is why you are getting paid for. But you don't want that to be spread everywhere in your application. So you do like a functional pure core and then an imperative shell, also called the onion architecture. And this is the same, domain infrastructure. Maybe the difference will be on what language do you use inside your functional core. Is this just mathematical functional monads and things like that, or do you want to express the business language instead? It's up to you. The good thing about that, as you might understand, you can plug any kind of adapter to the domain. It's a plug-and-play architecture. If tomorrow I need to switch from the FTP to the HTTP, it's not more complex because we're 2 months in. My adapter is like 50 lines long. What I need to do is just to provide another implementation of the few methods using another protocol, and this is a short thing to do. That means you can defer technical decision, and this is what, in my opinion, a great architect can do. It's not like when you're a good architect, you have a lot of experience with different kind of databases, so you're able to answer the question, what kind of database do we need to use? You are the senior developer, so you should know that. My preferred answer is, we don't care for the moment. Like, I will give you the best educated guess with the information we have now, but really, until we're in production, do we really know exactly? So do we need to go for the fancy, complex stuff right now? Or can we ship fast with a simple solution that works today, that is reasonable, and if we need to change tomorrow, we will be able to do that without it being too complex. Because if I can make the change in 1 month and it's still as easy to do the change, it's fine. It's not fine when you know that you're committing to a technology, and if you're committing to it in 6 months, it would be hard for you to change the technology. It's only the first step, though, and this is a limitation. I was able to do that in 35 minutes. that means you will have a lot of questions when you apply that in actual production code. The usual question is, where do I put the files? Well, it doesn't tell you anything about that, and I will tell you it's up to you. It depends on the maturity of your team, on how you're comfortable. Can you make the framework just live in the infrastructure part? It will be ideal. Some people start with like a folder domain, a folder infrastructure, and split like that. I tend to prefer using something we call the screaming architecture, which is I put the business in my folder names. So when I'm looking at the architecture of my application, oh, there is search and checkout, one-way round trip, you are in the transportation business. It's not just any model view controller kind of folder, technical one, and I don't know what you're doing exactly. But really, it's up to you. I will recommend you to start with that and then go further with the clean architecture. It just gives you more layers. So it answers the detailed question, like, okay, this thing is more to the outside world, and this thing is more, like, it's closer to the business, but not exactly, where do I put that? This thing gathers the existing knowledge about the different kind of architecture and gives you more layer. But the rule is still the same, dependency rule from the outside to the inside. So start with extracting the domain part and make that not depend on the infrastructure. This is the first step you need to do. And finally, if you want to build a strong domain, like this domain part, you will have a lot of classes inside and more business logic. And to make that grow, if you're not building a prototype, if you're not in a hackathon, if you're building something you're making money with and you aim to maintain for more than 1 year, I strongly recommend you to bring your team to get into domain-driven design, not really much for the technical patterns. They're interesting, but they're not the most interesting thing, but about the importance of the language and the concept that you can have different models. You don't have to have one big departure model to represent everything in your application, but you have context. That's it. Please remember Monday at work. Start thinking about domain, infrastructure, and how you could separate them both. Thank you very much. Yeah, I saved 2-3 minutes for the questions. If you have some, please, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your speech. It was really great, but I have a question. It really seems to be a domain-driven design, but you forgot to talk about application layer, and you kind of mix it together with infrastructure. Would you like to know why? And I have a second question, more practical, from my practice. So should all exceptions be converted to domain?
Clean architecture or other kind of architecture that introduce that layer. I told you you need more layers in the infrastructure, and the application layer is in the middle. It's more on the infrastructure side. Really go into clean architecture. You have more information about that. And regarding so I have an exception. Should I convert that into domain exceptions, all the exceptions, including the infrastructure one? No, it depends. If it's a purely infrastructure, like technical exception, it's a technical exception. So it's fine to have a mix of both in your application. How you do that might be interesting to discuss, but we won't have time. I will stay outside if you want to dig into more details of that kind of question. But yes, you can have both kind of exceptions in your application overall. Final question. I know there is lunch. All right. Thank you very much.